So, hello everyone, my name is Andrew Bray. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia, and my talk today is titled Talking About Hockey, the Canadian English and the Speech of American-Born Players. So this will be a linguistics talk, so I know a lot of people might not have a background in linguistics. I'll do my best to explain some of the more technical terminology as I go. But I want to start by looking at this notion that hockey is uniquely Canadian, or hockey is, in a sense, Canada's game. And in Hockey, A Global History, Hardy and Holloman really summarize the early importance of Canada to the international hockey community with this quote here. By 1920, Canada became the hockey nation in minds of both Canadians and non-Canadians. And I wanted to look at a little bit of demographical history of the major North American leagues to see, does this hold true? And as you can see, looking at NHL, AHL, and ECHL demographics, these were really, really Canadian leagues, and not just at the beginning, but for a very long portion of their existence. If we look here in 1920, we see that Canadians made up upwards of 80 to 90%, and it rose almost to 100% approaching the 60s. In fact, Canadian percentage in the NHL didn't fall below 75% until 1988-89 season, and for the AHL, 1991-92 season. So this really is true that hockey has been historically very Canadian, and you can see the Americans have been a relatively small portion of either of these three leagues. But if you look at the recent trend, you see there's a bit of a change occurring in the sense that Americans are rising. The percentage of Americans in each league has risen, and this has been a steady increase. And the Canadian percentage is dropping. So the league is becoming more balanced. We're seeing more Americans, we're seeing less Canadians on a given roster. Sorry. But the question I want to ask here is, what impact does this historical Canadian hockey nation mythos have on players from other countries? If we are going to say that hockey is a Canadian sport, what sort of influence is this going to have on players not born in Canada? And my research specifically looks at players born in the United States. So I started this research back in 2015, where I was trying to collect a lexicon of hockey-specific slang, all the terms we all know, dangle, snipe, celly, all these terms that we hear all the time. And while doing this, some Canadian influence kind of came out throughout these interviews, one being this Canadian folk origin for a lot of the hockey-specific terminology, and then the other being something that was somewhat unexpected. And this was the manifestation of what are called standard Canadian English variables, which are uncommon or unattested in American regional dialects. This actually was a question asked to me, oh, are you here to study why all the Americans sound like fake Canadians? And I thought this is a good time to go back and try to take up the answer and answer that question. So my current study attempts to answer two questions off of that original point. And one being, have American-born players adopted variables of standard Canadian English? If so, what specifically have they adopted? And is this a uniform process throughout the players being studied? And then the second question, why would this occur? So what are some possible explanations for this if they're present? And what motivation would have caused this adoption? So I want to begin by explaining a little bit about what is called standard Canadian English. And after listening to all the talks, I'm well aware a lot of you are very aware of what makes Canadian English distinct from other dialects spoken in North America. But I'm going to turn to a linguistic perspective to kind of explain it a little more in depth from my field. So the Atlas of North American English distinguishes standard Canadian English based on the following criteria. The first component being the Canadian shift. And this is, I'm going to use what are called keywords here. So listen to the vowel in each of these words as I say the word to get an idea of what sound I'm talking about. But it's the lowering and retraction of the tongue when pronouncing words like kit, dress, and trap. And this is thought to be triggered by the merger of two vowels that are occurring at the back of the mouth, lot and thought. Then what I'm going to be talking about today, the second component, which is called Canadian raising, which is the raising of the tongue in the mouth when you say words like tight and house, specifically these vowels occurring before voiceless consonants. And also there is the idea that Canadian English typically has more peripheral, meaning fronted or backed position of the tongue, almost stable in its height as well in words like face and goat. So throughout this talk, you'll hear me say things like tie and tight. And what I want you to think of is the vowel that I'm producing in these keywords. So those will be the first two I look at. And then things like cow and down and house, and hear how these all have what would be considered the same vowel in a lot of the different North American Englishes. So Canadian raising specifically has been studied for a very long time. It's a very well-documented variable. It was originally noted by Hoos back in 1942, but really analyzed in depth by Chambers in the 70s and 80s. And like I said a second ago, Canadian raising is the process in which the body of the tongue raises in the vowel space before voiceless consonants. So what this means is the area just behind the tip of your tongue comes up in your mouth when you're trying to make these specific vowels when they're occurring in front of voiceless consonants. This would create distinction between words like tie and tight. And you can kind of hear that in my own speech where you have tie and tight a little bit raised, and then cow and house. So in each of these pairs, the second one, the body of the tongue is slightly raised in individual with Canadian raising. And this occurs in front of voiceless consonants. So things like p, t, k, th, f, s, and ch. And these are called voiceless because there's no vocal fold vibration during these sounds. So we can actually quantify the height of the tongue based off of things that we call formants. Specifically, the first formant or F1 value of a vowel corresponds to roughly how high your tongue is in your mouth when you are pronouncing a vowel. So formants are just resonant frequencies of the vocal tract, and they're amplified groups of harmonics. So we amplify some harmonics while dampening others, and you'll see in a second what this looks like in a sound wave. But F1 values inversely correspond to tongue height. So if you have a very high F1 value, that means you have a low vowel, so the tongue is lower in the mouth, as opposed to if you have a very low F1 value, you have a high vowel, the tongue is high in the mouth. So individuals who exhibit Canadian raising should have smaller tight and house F1 values than their corresponding tie and cow values. So here you can see a spectrogram, and this is for a utterance I was about 4, and this was from my data set. And what you can look through here is you'll see there are some dark bands in that middle section, and these dark bands correspond to those formants. Those are those amplified resonant frequencies. So where the red dots are roughly tracking the formants throughout this production. And I want you to specifically look at what I've highlighted here, and about being one of those vowels, one of those tokens that I'm looking at. And you can see we have this first dark band with the red dots going through it, and you can see it's at about 618 hertz. So we can quantify roughly where the tongue is by looking at these formants as you go through your data. And luckily, there has been work that has established just how much variation there has to be between these two different vowels in order to say this is Canadian raising. So the Atlas North American English establishes a difference of 60 hertz. So you'd expect to see 60 hertz difference between raised and unraised variants. And actually, further work has been done here by Boberg in his book, The English Language in Canada, where he found the difference was even larger than that for most Canadian speakers. His average difference was 110 hertz between tie and height. So the tongue was 110 hertz higher for tight than tie, and 142 hertz when you look at something like house versus cow. And furthermore, Boberg established a third variant, which the Atlas North American English doesn't really talk about. And it's this vowel in front of nasal sound. So you get this third variant down, where you have this being a distinctly different vowel than cow and house, where you have that ow sound in front of a nasal sound. His data shows that this down house difference in Canadian speakers is typically a little bit less than, let's say, the difference between cow and house. But it's 85 hertz as opposed to 142. So very similar, and still both greater than that 60 hertz difference that's expected in Canadian raising. And for anyone wondering, nasal sounds are just sounds where you have the airflow go up into the nasal passage. So these are sounds like and so m, n, and angma here. And before I go into my data, I do want to say this is not uniquely Canadian, although the name might suggest so. Canadian raising is attested in the United States, specifically the raising of tight. So a lot of Americans will say tie and tight with noticeably different vowels. That is occurring in numerous regions, especially the ones that border Canada, for instance. However, the raising of house is far less common. It has been attested in Eastern New England and also the upper Midwest, so think Minnesota, Wisconsin, but it is not nearly as common in the United States. So for this study, I went out and decided to collect my own data through sociolinguistic interviews. And these were semi-structured. So I had a script that I went in there, and my goal was to prompt speech as close to natural as possible. So I did this by coming up with modules of questions. So after getting some demographic information, I started to ask players about their careers up to and including their current status as professionals, because the teams I selected were from the AHL and ECHL. These teams were typically selected because of their abundance of American players to kind of really highlight heighten my chances to interview American players. So after talking to them a little bit about their career up to and including their professional level, I decided to ask them a little bit about their idea of the influence of Canada on hockey and also the locker room demographics of Canadians versus Americans, and then try to get a little bit of meta-linguistic knowledge on if they're aware of are the differences occurring in the speech. So interviews typically were only about 30 minutes long. I got 20 players included in this analysis. They were all interviews occurred between 2017-18 season and the 2018-19 season. And typically I would go and interview as many people as were willing to talk to me in a setting, and then I would come back again the next day. If you know where Athens, Georgia is, I'm nowhere near most of these teams, so there was a lot of travel involved to get this data. And then from an acoustic standpoint, all the recordings were done right after practice had finished. This allowed me to keep the context of hockey consistent. As my questions all pertain to hockey, I wanted to keep them thinking about the sport. And I transcribed interviews, aligned them with the sound files, and uploaded them to what's called the Dartmouth Linguistic Automation, which then returns those formant values I was talking about a minute ago at different duration percentage points of the vowel. So at 20% of the vowel, it'd give me a value, 35, and so on. And then I removed some tokens. In linguistics, typically you remove the unstressed tokens because they're not as pronounced, and you also remove vowel tokens before the sounds L and R, L and R, because these tend to alter the way the vowel is being produced. And then I normalized the data using a log mean normalization process that's pretty common in linguistics and also used in the Atlas North American English. And I came up with this rudimentary equation that would give me the difference to see were these players reaching 60 hertz difference. So I subtracted the value of I subtracted the value of tight from tie to see was this 60 hertz less. The same, I subtracted house from cow, and also I subtracted house from down to see were these Americans raising the way you would expect for Canadians. From there, I also wanted to look at some social factors to see was there anything outside of being a hockey player that influenced this. So I looked at what region these players were from according to the Atlas North American English. These included places like Eastern New England, the Mid-Atlantic, the North, the Upper Midwest, the West and Western Pennsylvania. I looked at their current level of play, AHL or ECHL, their pre-professional career pathway, were they collegiate or major junior, their age, and also their current status on the team. As you know, this didn't correspond well to their actual age because I had some rookies that were 25. I had some veterans that had been playing on teams since they were 18. So I decided to code for both of these, and player was then utilized as a random effect. So turning to the results, you can see here in this plot, I have a trajectory of the vowel. So I want you to think of this as the movement of your tongue as you go through the duration of the speech. So it dips down a little bit before raising in both instances. And you can see the y-axis here has been inverted. So it better corresponds to the idea of how high the tongue is in the mouth. So if you look at the orange line, this is tight. You can see it is noticeably higher than the tie line. And below it, you can see the hertz differences. So on average, at 20%, very beginning of the vowel, players only differed by about 40 hertz, which is obviously below the 60 hertz expectation or benchmark that I just mentioned a minute ago. But by 35%, they had reached this. And in fact, it just kept getting bigger. As you go throughout the vowel, you see 50%, 110 hertz difference, 65, 142, 80, 118. And every single player by that midpoint at 50% had exceeded the 60 hertz expectation. So for tie and tight, yes, the players were absolutely raising, and this is what you'd expect for Canadian English. In fact, they actually surpassed what you'd expect for Canadian English. Most of these players raised more than Canadians were expected to based off of the English language in Canada data. So it was really uniform. That uniformity was completely lost when I started looking at the house vowel. So I want you to first look at the red and blue line here. So I have three vowels all on top of each other in this chart, but if you look at house and cow, the first two, you'll see this is the more typically studied version of this raising. And you can see the lines actually get closer and closer as you go throughout the vowel. So as you get to 50 and 60 and 65 and 80, the values get less and less. So the players started with a 49 hertz difference between the two, and it dropped to 38, and then 30, 24, 14. This is not what you'd expect for people that are raising. So this would not sound exactly like what you'd think for Canadian English and words like house. But I'm going to touch on that again in a minute because there is a lot of similarity here. 7 of the 20 players did actually, though, hit that 60 hertz benchmark. So there were players that did raise like you'd expect in Canadian English or standard Canadian English, although the majority didn't hit that. And of those 7, only 2 actually were able to keep a difference of 60 hertz. So really more like 5 of them were really raising how you'd expect for standard Canadian English. And of those 5, you'll see they're not from the most surprising areas. I have 3 players from the upper Midwest, Minnesota and Wisconsin, that were raising how you'd expect in Canadian English. one from the north, and then one from eastern New England. Like I said, two of those regions have had this type of raising attested. Interestingly enough, 6 of my 20 players had negative differentials. So that means they were doing the inverse of raising. Very, very unexpected if you're looking at what is occurring here. Oh, sorry. So turning to down here, you can see there is a bit of a difference where this was unexpected. So the down versus house difference actually did surpass the Canadian raising expectation. So we have by 65 hertz, we were at 66 hertz. Sorry, 65%, we were at 66 hertz. That amount remained the same, 80. And you can see this looks a lot more similar to what you saw with the tie-tight difference. So this is what was unexpected. We had a lot of players that were raising with respect to this house and down variant, but not cow and house. So this was very different. And we had a lot of players that almost hit that 60 hertz benchmark. So I ended up with 16 of the 20 were either raising or almost raising when I looked at down instead of cow, which goes against what is happening in Canada, but also corresponds a little bit better to what we would expect. Because I'm running a little bit out of time, I'm going to skip ahead here a second and get to my discussion and conclusion here. Basically, all of the players exhibited tight raising, which is unexpected, which is expected because they're from regions where this has occurred. Very few players, 7 of the 20, had house raising that looked like Canadian English, which is, again, not shocking. And they're also from regions where it's attested. What's really weird about this data and what's really fascinating to me is that a lot of players were raising house when they were looking at down instead of cow, which is completely novel in all the research I've looked into. I haven't seen this in any other dialects. It's definitely not common in the United States. And if you look at the data, it actually corresponds pretty well to what you'd see in Canada. So why I think this is happening, there are really 2 different attitudes that develop throughout the interviewing process. The 2 different attitudes being, one from my first speaker here, Jones. He said to me, you want to sound like a hockey player. And Canadians, they sound like hockey players. So this could be a process of, I know Canadians, they have that hockey mythos. I want to sound a hockey player. I'm going to try and sound more Canadian. But then the opposite side developed from players that told me they didn't think they sounded Canadian. And they gave me quotes like this. Well, I don't think an American's trying to sound Canadian. I think a hockey player is trying to sound like a hockey player. So I think that there's some work to do here to figure out what is this idea of sounding like a hockey player and how is it distinctly different from, let's say, Canadian English and maybe somewhere in between the 2. And I'll leave you with my final future research question. Why were some players raising house against down, but not cow? And I think the important thing to remember here is if you've ever heard the stereotype or shibboleth of Canadian English, this idea of oot and a boot, I think you're aware that there's this meta-linguistic awareness that people make fun of Canadian oot and a boot. And the players were some of the people that pointed that out too. What's interesting though, out and about were my 2 most common tokens of house. And if you look at my players average, it was 373, Canadian English average 732. They're 5 hertz difference. So the players that thought they sounded nothing like Canadians were saying the vowel the exact same way. So I am out of time. Thank you all for listening, and we'll move on to our next talk.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, Shona, it's your turn. Your mic is off, though.
Perfect. You all didn't need to hear me cursing the PowerPoint. My topic is, I've kind of titled it 2 minutes for improper language, what's in a word, a look at language use in hockey. I'd like to take a second to just acknowledge that I am situated on Treaty 6 lands out in Edmonton, which is the traditional meeting place of Métis and Inuit groups, as well as First Nations groups such as the Dene and the Nakota Cree and the Cree and the Nakota Sioux. So we'll just give it a sec, or just give that a sec. All right, why are you doing this to me? Of course it's gonna do this to me. Perfect. So what's in the presentation today is just a look at two theories. I should preface this by saying I'm not an academic, I'm a social worker. Sort of an academic, but not the same as a linguistic academic that you just heard. And then how it connects to hockey and some of the examples that are pretty easy to pull out of hockey that show where this has an impact. So theory, or that stuff someone thought explained why things happen. So one of the theories that I think really does talk about how we use language is social learning theory. And the basis of that theory is really simply that society teaches individuals through positive or negative feedback. So it teaches us how we should interact with others, what kind of things we should expect if we make a mistake, and how things are changed. So it's particularly important in the learning of languages. Language is how we communicate and we indicate these cues of things that are important and that to others around us. And it's also found social language or social learning theory is found to be important, but it's an offshoot of postmodernist thought, and postmodernism is based on the concepts of subjectivity, that it is a not positivistic way of looking at things. So there's no one truth, and also that language has a sizable impact on the perception of the world. And that last point is especially key in understanding why postmodernism might be important to thinking about how we look at language in hockey. So how does this connect to hockey? You know, how we talk about things. Hockey's a game that's played. How is that important? So hockey doesn't exist in a vacuum, and how we think about hockey, how we interact with hockey is driven by language, because language is how we understand our world. Hockey itself exists as a representation of culture, and like I said, it's contextualized through that language. If you look at it in a very simplistic way, the way that we talk about men and women's hockey is not the same. There are those cues that you see in like media representations, or even in general speech, that indicate a different societal value. So when we do that, we send messages to both players, participants in the hockey world, and to the world in general. And some of those messages I think are really helpful, and some of them I think are not. So I've pulled some, and they skew heavily towards the not helpful category, for the record. So one example you'll find a lot when we talk about positions, defenseman is a really good example. In hockey, you know, you have a defenseman. Defenseman is a gendered term, and it sets the default to a male perspective. You could think a non-gendered term would be defender, but we don't use that. It's not generally part of the hockey vernacular. It's defenseman. And then it gets modified to defensewoman for female hockey, which then, you know, the modification in and of itself sends a message. Often hockey players are called boys and girls, even long past the time we would expect them to be considered adults. So this is particularly apparent sometimes when coaches, they'll be like, oh, the boys, or oh, the girls, or and this is interesting because it, in some ways, it signifies an obviation of responsibility. So hockey players are able to then fall into that boys will be boys for poor behavior, even if they're 18 or 19, and in a general social way, we would expect something different than their behaviors. And then another one you'll see is obviously girls hockey, or she plays like a girl, or you play like a girl. And this one is important because societally it diminishes an achievement. It somehow makes women's hockey or girls hockey for age appropriate levels to be less than the default back to defensemen, which is men's hockey. So it becomes less than. And then the last one I just wanted to touch on is this idea of sportsmanship or sportswomanship, and how those are societally portrayed in different manners based on expectations of gender. So then here you're seeing gender creep into how players are expected to behave. And that's kind of set out in their code or their ethical codes of behavior. But they're like defensemen or defensewomen, they're gendered, and there's different expectations placed on the gender roles based on the words used. Sportsmanship has this kind of idea of upholding ethical principles and playing the game right, where sportswomanship has a definite, more feminine characteristic where even if you see in women's hockey, it's kind of like that no hitting rule coming through. So why did I bring up negative examples and messaging I find to be super unhelpful in how we talk about hockey? And that's primarily because I think it needs to change. I mentioned that I'm a social worker, and as a social worker, one of the things that we focus on is how messages are sent, especially to vulnerable or marginalized groups, messages of inclusion or inclusivity or belonging. And I think that language is one of the most powerful ways that you send those. It's one of the reasons we advocate for what's called human rights-based language in a lot of publications. And that just basically is universal and inclusive language that incorporates everybody and their right to belong. So I think that the linguistic pieces used in hockey, the word choices and the messaging that they're sending unintentionally or intentionally impedes change. And then it normalizes toxic behaviors, especially in that boys will be boys mythos, by referring to adult men and women as boys or girls. You're kind of impeding their ability or negating their ability to be accountable and responsible members of society. And then I think it also denies the social significance of sport. We had a little bit of that in the first talk of the morning, where sport serves as a site of great social significance for a number of people. And then if we're not careful about how we utilize language to speak about sport, then we're inadvertently sending messaging that excludes those people from a site of social importance or an ability to participate more fully in society. So I really do think that, while it may seem trivial, like things like word choices like defenseman instead of defender, or calling adult individuals girls or boys, sends a very powerful messaging that we don't often sit down and think about. And it's important to do that, to be intentional around that use of language, because we are often so unintentional in how we use it. And obviously this is the slide of proving I didn't just make all of this up on my own. So yeah, I will stop sharing my screen. I see the chat box is full of things, but and definitely I'm happy to take any questions towards the end, I think, so that Julie has full time to talk about her piece.
Thanks, Shona. That was interesting. Okay, let me share my screen now. Okay, so we're going back to a bit more of linguistics, but I'm talking about what non-specialists think about hockey English. Is that working? So I'm Julie Dallinges. I'm French. I'm working in two universities, one in Western Ontario and then one in Aix-Marseille, where I'm right now. So we've got the time change difference. Today I'm going to be talking about Ontarians' perception of hockey English that I define as the hockey way of speaking, regardless of the level or experience of the speakers. So I will present briefly my methodology, my research questions, And then we're gonna have a look at my general sample, and then I will discuss the results. So I created a 3-part online survey on Qualtrics, and so I got the demographic information, I collected broad traditional information, and then I added a subsection on hockey to know if my respondents were hockey players, to have the hockey self-perception. So I have a question, have you ever played hockey? And if this person says yes, then she can keep going. And there's one more interesting question that was, are you currently playing hockey? The second part of the questionnaire was the study question, and they were made to elicit perception about hockey English and Canadian English in general, but we won't be talking about that in this presentation. The last part was the listening task, and it was made to examine whether hockey English was perceived as typically Canadian. So let's see what was precisely in the listening task, because that was a bit more, it's the complicated part, I guess. So it's Canadian raising, and Andrew mentioned it, so that's what I was studying. So I used 10 stimuli extracted from informal conversation. You've got 5 sentences from the PAC LHC corpus, which is my corpus from hockey players in London, Ontario. I've got 1 male speaker, and then you have 1 sentence with 1 Canadian raising, 1 with 2 Canadian raising, and 1 without. And then I have a female speaker, 1 with 1 Canadian raising and 1 without. You've got the same pattern for 5 sentences from the SWOR corpus, which is the Southwestern Ontario Regional English Corpus, so which represent Southwestern Ontario speech. And these guys were not hockey players. The participants of the survey were invited to rate the accent and the Canadianness on a 5-point scale from very neutral to very accented, for example, and they had to evaluate if the speaker could be a hockey player. They were invited to give explanation if they thought it was a hockey player. So my research question, do Ontarians think there is a hockey English, and is hockey English perceived as typically Canadian? Let's look at my sample. I've got 125 finished survey for now, and this is still ongoing, so my survey is still online. The women are 74%, so it's like mostly women for now. It's 20-29 years old for 46%, and then followed by 50-59 years old. The education, like as regarding education, I've got bachelor degrees, 48%, so a majority or almost completed or in progress. Regarding work, it's professional and management jobs, 52%. And then the interesting part, which is not what I'm very proud of, but right now, the question, have you ever played hockey, was only answered positively by 42% of the sample. And then currently playing among these 42% is only 43%. So it's mostly not hockey players and not like the hockey community right there. So do Ontarians think there is a hockey English? Let's have a look at the question and what were the responses. So I've got 70 respondents, so 56% of the sample who said yes. Yes, there is a hockey English. Let's zoom in to see who said so. I got 83% of current players and 58 who have ever played hockey. Regarding gender, it's a yes for male respondents for 77% and a no for 51% of the female. So female mostly think there is no hockey English. Regarding age, we've got young guys, older guys, yes, for like 20, 29, 70, 79 for 75%. So it's quite high. And then a no for 40 to 69 years old. What does a hockey player sound like? So that was another question. And all the question where you're going to see all the little players. because it was text entry and I've got lots of examples, so I was thinking it was pertinent to show. So I've got lots of precise examples, and then the slang was mentioned, of course, the lingo, vocabulary, expression, phrases. Then you've got negative comments of, I don't want to offend anyone, but yeah, it was like annoying, stupid, uneducated, less sophisticated, and so on. You've got some positive comment as the more relaxed, and so on. You can see the Canadian, the broad speech, short sentences. Yeah. What made you think so? So this question was asked when the people said, yes, I think that's a hockey player. So then I asked, can you give me explanation? What made you think so? If you look at the table there, at the top, it's the two players from my corpus, so they're hockey players. At the bottom, it's the speakers from the other corpus, who are not hockey players. So you can read the example, but the majority of people thought about the intonation, the pronunciation of vowels, and the pauses. Do you think there are differences between male and female hockey players? So the gender difference, men said no for 60%. So men think the hockey English is the same when it's spoken by women and men, but women said no at 67%. So it's surprising that women think there is no hockey English. When they say yes, I ask, what, can you explain the difference? Can you give me details? And so you can see the result there. It's a main way of speaking. That's 35% of the sample. Women don't speak hockey English for 20%. Women speak hockey English to a certain extent, or women are more or less something. And women are more refined, for example. Do you think hockey English is only used in the context of playing? That's a no for 91%. So where is hockey English talked? People think hockey English is talked everywhere. It's spoken with hockey players. It's spoken while drinking or watching the media like the news, on a casual setting, or it's a male boy way of speaking. Regarding accent, so I have to remind you, it was first the scale. So first they rated on like the accent, and then the question about, do you think this guy is a hockey player, was at the end. So if the participant thought, yes, that's a hockey player, the accent was somewhat accented for 35% of the sample. If the person thought, no, not a hockey player, the accent was very neutral, decreasing toward very accented for 4%. So it looks like hockey players are perceived as having a more accented way of speaking overall. Is hockey English perceived as typically Canadian? That's my second research question. Let's see. So do you think hockey English is distinct from Canadian English in general? That was a yes for 63% of the sample. Yes, hockey English is distinct. So let's see, why do people think it's different? It's different, again, because of the slang, the vocabulary, expression used in hockey. It's different because of the pronunciation and intonation. I had precise examples again, because if you're not part of the hockey community, you cannot understand what hockey players say. And then I've got the Canadian English there with a star, because we're going to look into that more into details. Hockey English seems to be perceived as an exaggerated Canadian English, as you can read in the examples. For example, an exaggerated rural Canadian accent. And at the same time, it's perceived as Canadian English, just the basic Canadian English language, the same as other Canadians, except with different phrases mixed in. So the slang is right there again. Let's have a look at how did people rated Canadianness. So same as accent, they rated and then they said yes or no if it could be a hockey player. If yes was selected, yes, I think that's a hockey player. Very Canadian was the choice of 56% of the sample, and then followed by somewhat Canadian. If no was selected, it was somewhat Canadian for 36%, and then up to neither Canadian, no Canadian for 33%, and then very non-Canadian for 8%. Have hockey players been recognized? So the stimuli were chosen, hockey players, non-hockey players, and then I wanted to see if with the Canadian raising and the way they were spoken in the stimuli, do people would say, yes, that's a hockey player? Unfortunately, no. People did not recognize my players. So the 24 there is the male speaker from the over corpus, which is not a hockey player, and he got the higher rate of yes, that's a hockey player. I've got a sound sample that I can play. So that was the pronunciation of out and about in his talk right there. That was important. And then my male speaker, who was a player, got only 4 to 15%. That's one sentence. I'm hoping you can hear the sentences. Oh, that's very... Yeah, I don't know if the sound was loud enough. And then, okay, I'm gonna finish on this. Then the RS1 was my female player. She got 5 to 45% because she said like in the sentence I choose, I choose the topic to be about their free time to be all the same. So they're all talking about things they like to do. And she says she likes sports. And so all people said, oh, she likes sports. So she must be a hockey player because, of course, if she likes sports, she's playing hockey. So she's got 41, but only because they're all mentioning the topic. 22 is the female speaker from the over corpus, so she's not a player, and she get 5 and 4%. So the same as the hockey player one, 5%. And you can see the difference. It's 5 for the girl and up to 15 for the boy. So it looks like there is no women hockey players way of speaking. I'm going to finish on a very surprising result that is Canadian raising perceived to be associated with hockey English. In a way, yes, because some people said, yes, that's a hockey player, and then said the way he pronounced about nice, like all the Canadian raising features that I mentioned earlier. But then you've got this result right there and at the bottom of the slide, and you've got the association of very non-Canadian with the Canadian raising. So the first one is the female speaker with 1 Canadian raising. She's got 2% of very non-Canadian and 4 of somewhat non-Canadian. But then the 2 male speakers, they went up to 15 and 10% of very non-Canadian rate on Canadianness, which is quite something I didn't expect. Oh. Thank you. I'd be happy to reply to any question. And so my survey is still ongoing. So if you have any question about that, I'm still looking for participants. The only criteria is to be born and to live in Ontario right now. Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing. Okay. So we're gonna, oh, there are like so many questions already in the chat. We've got 10 minutes for question right now. So I think, Andrew, you got one in the chat, but you already answered, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, okay.
I think Rachel has a question.
Yeah. They were all really interesting. The stuff about the raising I thought was really interesting. I didn't know any of that. But I just wanted to, maybe you guys can touch on this, like where this stereotype of the out and about came from, like, because I've literally never met a single Canadian who pronounces it like oot and a boot. So I don't know where this came from or why people think that this is a thing, because I've never met a single person who pronounces that way. So maybe you guys can shed some light on where you think maybe this came from in your research.
Yeah, I think I can take this for a second here. And I think a lot of it has to do with the border states in the US and the different regional accents that kind of line up, well, I should say dialects that kind of line up with Canada. In a lot of these places, you have Americans that do participate in Canadian raising, even if just to a slight degree. So for instance, there have been some studies on perception in Detroit, Michigan, which happens to be where I'm from. And the Detroiters would say that the person sounded like they were from Michigan, with just a little bit of external influence, even if they were raising. So it is more of a non-realization that a lot of Americans raise. So to make fun of Canadians, they had to kind of take it to an extreme. So if you think about where the tongue is, if you go from like ow and go up to o, and if you go all the way up to the top of your mouth, you get ooh. So you get oot and a boot. So
Right.
It's like an over exaggeration of a really small movement. And it's likely because the people that were coming up with this pseudo insult or stereotype were also raisers themselves and
Okay.
were unaware of their own raising. So they had to raise from where they already were. So if you're saying out instead of out. So like if you're down here in the South, you expect someone to say out. But if you're up in Michigan, you might say out, which is more Canadian. But if you want to make fun of a Canadian, now you have to say oot. You have to go all the way to this extreme. So I would guess it's something on those lines where you have people that already raised to a bit, wanted to make fun of the Canadian differences. So they maximize the difference.
Okay, that's interesting. So trying to maybe like forget the word, but compensate for their own what people might perceive as their own deficiencies or their own like idiosyncrasies in the way they speak. Okay, that's interesting.
And I think Julie can talk a little bit about perception on this, where a lot of us are very unaware of the speech we're producing. So we would perceive things differently. So we would perceive these people raising this vowel, even though we ourselves might be raising it. So then if we're going to mimic that, we're going to go to an extreme.
Okay. Thanks.
I have a comment for Shona. I really appreciate you tackling that topic because it's a very internal cultural component within hockey players themselves. At my institution, I say the men's team and the women's team. And I have friends who'll say, well, are the girls playing? And I'm like, are you talking high school? Are you talking college? What level are you talking about? And they get really irritated with me because they just assume that I'll understand that they're talking about the women's team.
Yeah, and that's like, for me, that was one of the key things. I have friends who do that as well, where they'll say, like, even if they talk about the Canadian women's national team, which are all adult women, they'll say the girls are playing on TV today or something like that. Even the Dream Gap, oh, the girls are on TV. But it irritates me because it's an unintentional diminishment or an unintentional infantilization that kind of is used to either diminish capacity and achievement or to infantilize and like shift blame. And I think that if you don't start to call it when you see it, like you're doing with your friends, Mila, like then you don't ever develop the intentional language to like actually combat it. And I truly believe that if you don't change the language around how you deal with something, that it won't actually change, because language is how we perceive and conceptualize our world around us.
Right.
For a lot of people.
The added layer is that within hockey players themselves, when I was talking to the assistant coach one time, she said, well, the girls call themselves girls.
Yeah. And I mean
themselves that the coaches refer to them as that. That is part of how they normalize the language.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and that's the thing is you would too call yourself, if I played hockey, I would probably call myself a girl too, because that is what I've been taught to do. That's the social learning aspect of it. You've learned the particular rituals and cultural and linguistical tics of this. And it actually ties really great into what Andrew was talking about, how, hockey players don't think that they're talking with a Canadian raising, even if they weren't born there. They think they're talking like hockey players because they've been taught a particular way of interacting with society. And, maybe it's how you say a vowel, or maybe it's a word choice you use. But if you're taught it and it becomes part of your understanding of the world, you're far less likely to question it, which is why then you get agitators who come in and are like, why are you calling them girls? Or, or do you not realize that you're not like, the way, even if you talk about like the exaggeration of vowel sounds to differentiate, like, I am Western Canadian. I know I have an accent, but if you put me in a room with a ton of Western Canadians, I would not be able to pick it up. I know that, right?
Yeah.
There's a self-perception there, but you don't get there if you don't sit down and be intentional about how you do things. So
yeah, the level that I tackle is just trying to get them not to say freaking ladies. It's like, if you're gonna say ladies, you got to say gentlemen. If you can't do that, then don't use the damn word.
Yeah, I like ladies more than female. I dislike the term female because I know that a lot of individuals who play hockey don't identify as male or female. They may identify as non-binary or preferring not to identify their gender. So sometimes I will default to ladies over female, but that's just on a level around on a scale of words I don't like. One of them has more.
If you bring up the dynamic of, what, as these naming terms continue to evolve, will there be different language that will start to be incorporated?
Yeah. And I think that that's key to the intersection of language and culture and sport and identity, which is fantastic and will be an amazing place to for people to do research. Go forth and research, researchers. One last question from anybody? Nobody? We're good?
Well, I'm going to ask one question to Andrew. I want to go back to the sounding as a Canadian player. Did you get more of that identity, like hockey persona thing that players wanted to do?
So I found it was kind of mixed, and I think a lot of it has some ties to the perception of, I guess, the value of being Canadian. But a lot of guys that were very much saying that, no, I don't sound Canadian, were the ones that were kind of stressing there is a hockey dialect. I speak this. I sound like a hockey player. But then I had some guys that were like, oh yeah, no, I sound Canadian. It's no big deal. And then I kind of had the in-betweeners there that said, like, I sound Canadian because hockey players sound Canadian. So I think I definitely think what you're looking at is entirely true. And it was crazy going through yours. I'm like, this corresponds exactly with what I'm looking at, that there's a perception of a Canadian, of a hockey dialect, because there seems to be a hockey dialect. I don't know how the Canadian component corresponds, because I've started off with the American side, but it'd be really interesting to, I think, look in to see if the Canadian hockey players were raising less because maybe the Americans don't raise as much and they're meeting somewhere in this middle space. That might be a uniquely hockey dialect, because if you go and you look at some of the work done on Canadian raising in places that raise but not to that degree, like Minnesota and Wisconsin, they raise but not as much. So maybe when you had those speakers talking, the people that were listening were expecting more raising, because it could be that there was less going on there. But there seems to be this idea that a lot of players are either fine with Canadian English and it doesn't bother them to say they sound Canadian, or they're very much saying, no, we've established our own dialect and it's not Canadian, it's not American, it's this third dialect. But then I always ask them afterwards, well, the people ask, are you Canadian on the street? And they're all like, oh yeah, of course. Like it's always the follow-up, like, oh yeah, I get confused with being Canadian all the time. One of the guys I was talking to said they were on a flight and they're like, oh, we're a hockey team. Like, oh, why are you flying down towards South Carolina? Like, aren't you guys supposed to be back up in Canada? Because it's just such a preconceived notion that hockey players are Canadian. even though some of the teams I talked to were, I think, upwards of 60% American. So.
Andrew, from a social aspect, I would wonder how much of that's like the intersection of trying to reclaim a culture of hockey for you were saying they're perceived as Canadian, if they're trying to reclaim that intersection of hockey as not uniquely Canadian, but hockey as, an American experience as well, right? If they're feeling like their cultural identity or their national identity is invalidated by their professional choices, you might get a bigger pushback because that's an intersection of identity, right?
Yeah. And I think a lot also probably has to do with, like I started at the beginning of the talk, you're dealing with a system in professional hockey where up until the early 1990s, it was so Canadian heavy that it's not even just the players were Canadian. If you go look at coaching staff, like all the coaches these guys ever played for probably were Canadian. They probably didn't have many Americans. So I think there's this overbearing Canadian influence on the culture. So the question I was asked here in the chat was, will this change? Because if you looked at the demographics, Americans, hopefully, maybe one day will catch up to Canadians in the NHL and we'll see like a 30-30 split. But they still told me, I asked them, will this change? If Americans ever somehow become the dominant group in the NHL, will you see less Canadian English being spoken in the locker room? And they all told me no. They're saying, no, it's so ingrained in this idea of what it is to be a hockey player that there's this Canadian speech. And I obviously am oversimplifying by saying Canadian English when there are hundreds of Canadian dialects, but there's this specific Canadian style of speech that these players think that this is what a hockey player sounds like, and I want to sound like a hockey player. And I think that also ties in with all the slang. So something that came up, I think, in every presentation today is hockey slang. And if you've looked into it, there's so much of it because there's this really strong desire to outwardly represent yourself as a hockey player. And I think the speech is the way to do it. And I think the players that really don't want to be seen as Canadian are the ones saying, no, it's hockey. It's definitely hockey. It's not Canada. And the guys that don't care as much, like, it's both.